It was summer, I believe the day after the 4th of July. I was in the middle of a long-haul trucking route, and I am a female trucker. I was driving through Nebraska, and for anyone who has driven across the state, you know it's a long, empty stretch of road. Looking out the window, I would swear I was just driving through the same 5 miles of farmland, over and over. I had just started getting a headache, and my dispatcher suggested I take a quick break to get rid of it. I remember allowing myself to doze off in my sleeper cab as I watched the beautiful colors of a prairie sunset. The rumbling of my empty stomach woke me up, and the first thing I noticed was how dark it was. I believe it was around 1 a.m. I had stopped at a truck stop with a small convenience store. I checked that my cargo was secure before heading inside. I needed to use the restroom and grab some food. Knowing I might not have another chance for quite a while, I went into the store to use the restroom. Both the men's and women's restrooms were down a little hall from the open area of the store. I was groggy and tired and realized how badly I needed to pee, so I shuffled into the women's restroom quickly. As I made my way the short distance from the door to the nearest of the 2 toilet stalls, I was shocked to make eye contact with a man coming out of the only other stall. I immediately felt my body tense up. A man in the women's restroom was definitely not right. He was clearly another trucker, as he stood in the trucker-only shower area, wearing a faded logo trucker cap. I wanted to turn around and leave, or call for help, but there was something in his expression that made me freeze. He had wild brown hair, nearly shoulder length, with strands sticking out from beneath his trucker cap in every direction. It looked like it hadn't seen a brush in weeks. He was wearing ragged clothing as well, a pair of ill-fitting black cargo pants, and I remember noting his scuffed work boots. He had several layers on top, and one of them was a large camouflage jacket. Keep in mind, this is Nebraska in July. The jacket was just hanging on his shoulders crooked, like he hadn't bothered to take a few more seconds to put it on correctly. He was carrying something in a tied-up plastic grocery bag. I gave a quick smile as our eyes met, and he just stared at me in return. Then, his face turned wild and intense-looking. His eyebrows were furrowed in anger, but his eyes were wide and intense. That's when I couldn't ignore the feeling anymore. I tried to brush it off. He walked over to the only sink, and I took my time shutting the stall door because something about his posture in front of the mirror struck me as odd, and I was trying to figure it out. He was standing with his body more angled toward me, but his face was turned into the mirror. His body was tense, and his legs were slightly crouched, as if he was ready to act out. His hands were not by his face, or he wasn't even washing them at the sink. They were just by his sides, with his elbows also slightly bent. I suddenly felt even more uncomfortable than before, and I didn't even think that was possible. Terror crept through me as I realized I was alone in the women's restroom, with a strange man who shouldn't be in there at all. I regretted leaving my purse and cell phone in my truck. I couldn't call for help, and my pepper spray was in my purse, which was no use to me locked in my truck. If I shouted, no one would hear me. The truck stop was nearly empty when I came in to use the facilities. Only one other truck was parked, and it likely belonged to him. Not to mention, the restrooms were tucked away from the main area. I shut and locked the toilet stall door. I took my time using the facilities. I wanted him gone before I left the safety of the stall. I stayed there long after I had finished, but the man was still there. So I waited longer. Finally, I heard the thudding of his work boots as he made his way to the door. I heard the door open and then slam closed. The door was pretty heavy, and it slammed the same way as when I had entered. I stayed for a moment and allowed the wave of relief to wash over me before I reached for the lock. Then, I paused, fingers only an inch from the lock. I stayed as silent as possible to confirm what I thought I heard. Breathing. Yes, the man had only pretended to leave. At this point, I was scared and confused. I knew something was very wrong when he tricked me into thinking he left, only to stick around and be as quiet as possible. So I stayed in the stall even longer. It must have been at least 20 minutes, but I had no way of knowing for sure. I could tell from the direction his breathing was coming from that he had positioned himself in the far corner, right next to the door, but far enough that I couldn't see his feet. Finally, I thought I heard him leave. This time I waited a few minutes to make sure he hadn't tried his trick again. I slipped out of the stall quickly. I washed my hands and rushed down the hallway of the store. It was pitch black outside, and I had no idea where he was, but he couldn't be far. Another female trucker was checking out at the register, so I waited near a window display until she left the store. I remember thinking how much better it would have been if she had come in to use the facilities. Then, I quietly slipped out the door behind her. Sure enough, crouched right outside the front door was the man. He seemed surprised. He stood and turned away, walking quickly around the side of the store toward the truck lot where the semis were parked. A few more now than when I went inside to use the facilities earlier. I hurried to my rig, locked all the doors, and started the engine. Through my mirrors, I could see him moving between the parked semis, scanning each cab as if looking for something, or someone. He paused at his own truck 2 spaces down from mine, but kept watching my rig as I pulled out. I would tell my dispatcher all about it once I was miles away from that truck stop. I love being on the road, and I love spending time by myself. I drive my semi across the country as an owner-operator and choose night routes whenever I can, or when dispatch offers them. Sometimes, I haul loads through metropolitan areas, and other times, I drive through rural counties to distant delivery points that can require multiple day hauls covering over 1,000 miles. Most times I stick to my delivery schedule, but pick my own routes when possible, simply because I like to drive. It's a good way to earn a living, and I love cruising down highways listening to music. It helps me think, and it soothes me. So this all happened on a Wednesday evening last month. I was hauling a high-value shipment of electronics on Interstate 80 with a tight delivery window for the distribution center that was 5 hours away. I had been driving for about 3 hours, making good time, when I spotted hazard lights flashing up ahead. As I got closer, I could see it was a broken-down sedan on the shoulder, with someone waving frantically for help. I knew stopping wasn't ideal with my delivery schedule, but I couldn't just drive past someone who might be in real trouble on a desolate stretch of highway. I pulled my rig over about 50 yards ahead of the car and put on my hazards, planning to just make a quick call for roadside assistance. When I checked my side mirror, I saw a woman walking toward my truck. She looked to be in her mid-30s, well-dressed in a business suit despite the late hour, and seemed genuinely distressed. I rolled my window down partially, and she told me her car had suddenly died, and she had no cell service out here. Something didn't feel right to me. I was nervous about a possible setup. A woman alone at night on a desolate highway seemed like the perfect bait, especially with all the stories about cargo thefts targeting truckers. And I definitely hadn't lost cell service in this area. She kept insisting that I should step out of my truck to look at her car engine, saying she heard a strange noise before it stopped. My instincts were screaming at me by this point, so I told her I'd just call the highway patrol instead. As soon as I mentioned police, her demeanor changed completely. She stepped back from my truck and pulled out her phone, the same phone she had just claimed wasn't working. I immediately put my truck in gear, but before I could pull away, I saw movement in my mirrors. A man was standing by the passenger side of my truck, not moving a muscle, just staring in my direction. He had short, greasy black hair, was tall, was unusually pale with a muscular build. There was nothing behind those vacant eyes of his. I shouted through my window, asking what they wanted, but he didn't respond. The woman suddenly shrieked for me to stop the truck, saying they just needed help. I called back that I'd alert highway patrol for them, and pressed the gas, starting to accelerate. 3 more men suddenly appeared out of the shadows of the darkened trees. They ran toward my truck, but I was already picking up speed, and they couldn't catch up as my 18-wheeler gained momentum. The last thing I saw was them standing in the middle of the road, watching me. I was back up to highway speed when I called the state police on my Bluetooth to report what had gone down. The dispatcher thanked me for the information and said they'd send a patrol car to check it out. It was almost as dark gets by now, and that added to the creepiness of the situation. After driving for a few miles, I noticed high beams in my rearview mirror. The sedan was speeding up and getting closer to me by the second. I figured that they were the same people that were harassing me earlier. I was thankful to be safely locked in my cab, but definitely worried as the sedan easily kept pace with me for the next 12 miles. Then I noticed my fuel gauge was getting low. I'd need to stop soon with only about 75 miles of diesel left. I drove an additional 30 miles, hoping they would give up the chase, but they stayed right behind me through 8 turns onto different highways. They were following me, no question about it. I spotted a well-lit truck stop off the next exit and pulled in there, figuring there would be safety in numbers. I parked my rig at the pump under the brightest lights, and the sedan pulled in too, parking at the far edge of the lot in the shadows. I calmly walked inside, keeping an eye on my surroundings, and told the attendant I needed 300 gallons of diesel and that a suspicious vehicle had been following me since the highway. The attendant looked out the window, and then picked up the phone. I went back out to start pumping, one hand on the nozzle and the other gripping the tire thumper I always keep in my cab for protection. Not as good as a firearm, but I'd never been comfortable carrying a gun despite the risks of the job. I finished fueling and was about to climb back into my cab when somebody grabbed my arm from behind. I turned around and hit him with the tire thumper. He staggered back as I moved to put the truck between us, staying alert but not panicking. The man started toward me again, but stopped when the truck stop attendant came out with a shotgun. The attacker went back to the sedan, which drove away without plates, likely stolen, and they must have removed the plates before pursuing me. The attendant lowered his shotgun and nodded at me. After 10 years on the road, this wasn't my first brush with trouble, but it was certainly one of the more coordinated attempts I'd seen. The attendant offered me some coffee while we waited for the state troopers to arrive. I'm a 38-year-old trucker with over a decade of experience, and I've learned to stay prepared without panicking. I gave my statement to the highway patrol and showed them my dash cam footage of the fake breakdown scene. I was back on the road within an hour, no escort needed, determined to deliver my electronic shipment on schedule. If you haul freight, especially valuable loads, be aware of suspicious breakdowns, trust your instincts, keep your doors locked, and carry something for protection. These cargo theft rings are getting more sophisticated, and you never know what lengths they'll go to for a high-value shipment. One day after a community fundraiser, around 7:30 or 8 p.m., me and my boyfriend decided to go bowling. It was a long day of volunteering, and we felt like bowling would be nice. He asked if we could stop by his place so he could grab his bowling ball and shoes. I said that's fine, since it was maybe 15 minutes away from where we were, and in the same direction as we were headed. We stayed at his house for a bit, while he grabbed a quick drink, then we got in my car. My boyfriend then suggested we stop at a diner on the road to the bowling alley, so we could grab some food before bowling. Once again, I was fine with that, because we hadn't eaten a proper meal yet. So I drove us to the diner, and the only parking was on the side of an abandoned feed store next to the diner. To help form a better image, the diner and feed store were right next to each other, both entrances facing the same way. It was entirely dark outside. The diner was a fairly run-down place and didn't have any lights in the parking area, like most do. So it was pitch black, except for the light coming from my car. A semi-truck was on the side of the diner, and it had cones around it, which indicated to me he must be doing some kind of work. I assumed the parking spots wouldn't be too close, and I parked nearby. After we ate and paid, my boyfriend told me he needed to use the restroom. Once again, I was fine with that, and told him I would wait in the car since he would only be gone a few minutes. I locked my doors after I got in, as it was a force of habit for me to do so. I went on my phone for a bit, and after a couple of minutes, I saw a light flash on in the driver's side mirror of my car. I turned to look since it was pointed in my direction. A man had a flashlight pointed right at my window and just held it there for a few seconds, maybe 30 seconds or so. He was standing not far from the semi-truck I spotted earlier, so I assumed it was the driver who had been doing work on his truck. I was kind of freaked out, but I assumed he had a reason for doing so. He then began walking toward my window, still with the flashlight on. I rolled down my window no more than a couple of inches, assuming maybe he was just going to tell me to move my car. He stopped when he got 3 to 4 feet away from my window, then turned around. At this point, I was even more scared just because there was no clear reason for what he did. So I just rolled my window back up and waited for my boyfriend, still watching the guy just in case. I saw him rummage around in the front part of the semi-truck for a bit. Then he stopped and turned back to my car. There was something in his hand, although I'm not sure what, and I'm glad I don't have to know, to be honest. He began walking towards my window. He was saying something I couldn't hear, and it was at a rather loud volume. He got to my door this time and tried to open it. He tried to pull the handle a couple of times, but he couldn't open it. Then he started to pull more aggressively. That was when my boyfriend came out of the diner and was walking toward my car. He looked concerned, and I was absolutely terrified. The guy saw my boyfriend coming to my car, and he walked quickly back to his truck. I drove away pretty quick once my boyfriend got in. I'm not entirely sure what happened or what was going to happen. The only theory we had was that maybe, when the trucker saw that I was a woman alone the first time, when he had the flashlight, he assumed I'd be an easy target to rob, or worse. That's just a theory though, but I'm glad I never had to find out what he was doing.